as you can hear, this is, on the record. And I would say we start. So, welcome everyone.
Yes, good morning. Welcome to FEPS. My name is László Andor. I'm the Secretary General of FEPS, and I would like to just use a few minutes to welcome you all, together with Claudia Detsch, who is on my left, and it actually signals that we have a wonderful cooperation with Friedrich Ebert Stiftung on many topics, but in recent years, I must say that the question of the climate has been one of the main focus of our cooperation. And what I should just say in this moment, the elections a few days behind us, that we remain committed to this agenda. I think nobody should be complacent about the outcome of the elections. In the previous months, the media coverage of the political process was full of this doom and gloom. The far right is coming. It's going to eliminate all the agenda of the progressives in the European Union and elsewhere. And it's a little bit like crying wolf all the time in 2014, 19, and now. And we woke up on Monday and we saw that 55% is held by the center left, center right, and the liberals, which in principle should remain committed to the achievements of the previous cycle, not least because the wonderful Ursula von der Leyen always talked about the Green Deal as a major step forward for the European Union. And I think we are not just talking about this, we also mean it. And a lot of work in this organization in the last 6 months under the leadership of Thomas was also directed to this question, how to ensure that this policy is sustainable, and also translated to concrete ideas. And that's where I would kind of zoom on the topic of today, because in Brussels, it's not enough to, just commit to big ideas and be enthusiastic about it. But it's also our role as a progressive think tank to feed the policy process with concrete elements. Which our elected officials can use, whether in the European Parliament or in the European Commission or in other organizations, which we also appreciate. So that's also why the climate program, but our cooperations, not only with FES, but for example, also with Solidar, are very important in the search for a just transition, right? Because we don't see the green agenda in separation from the broader progressive agenda, but actually we look for the harmony between the various items of the progressive politics. And this is where we would not like to see any kind of backsliding. We would like to see kind of contrary, more concrete elements, even if it might be more difficult to negotiate at certain points, but concrete elements where we believe that forward steps and improvements can happen. That's why we are happy that there is another opportunity now to have a kind of research-based discussion. For FEPS, this is very important. Other political think tanks, which I don't want to comment on, may not invest so much in genuine research, but we do. And I think it's also important, it helps to develop a policy which would be sound when you present it, but also when implemented. And I would indeed welcome the main presenter, Professor Raphael Heffron. But before that, Claudia would also like to say a few words on behalf of FES.
Yes. Yes, Laszlo, all right.
Yeah, of course. We have online participants as well, exactly.
Okay. This event is part of our extended cooperation between the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and FEPS, especially in the climate and energy area. My colleague Stefan and we come from the FAS Competence Center for Climate and Social Justice, based here in Brussels. So one might say that we carry the relevance of the topic we want to discuss today already in our name, so to speak. And of course, if you think about climate justice, and the FES is a very global foundation, we are present in more than 100 countries around the world. So of course, when we talk about climate justice, this is already quite established, but I think more so far on the global level, the concept of climate justice endeavors here to distribute the burdens and opportunities of climate change fairly around the world. And I think now increasingly it penetrates also to the surface as well, that the same is true when it comes to the local level. And of course, Laszlo talked about the results of the recent elections. And I think this is really one lesson of this election. And as climate change mitigation involves to a big part an energy transition, of course, we also need to look at energy justice. Yes, so the impact of the energy transition on justice and social justice. We have recently conducted a population survey in 19 European and North American countries, 15 of those members of the European Union, about attitudes towards climate change and respective policies. And one result, and I think we really have to focus on this, is that an overwhelming majority, like 70%, stated to think, or let's say to fear, that people will be worse off due to transition policies. And of course, in those socially weaker milieus, this was even stronger. And also like 2/3 say that climate and environmental protection measures are socially unjust, as they place a particular burden on people who earn less. And 90% are in favor of a more just climate policy, because I think that's also important to say, 80% really stated they are quite concerned, of course, about climate change. And I think we need ambitious climate policy. But we have to be careful about the social implications here, or it's really going to explode in our faces. So I think this is really a precondition for a successful climate policy. And I guess that the discussions also here in Brussels are really focusing around this topic and this combination, as you already said, Laszlo. So establishing energy rights and defining minimum rights, this I think is one way of really doing this and of ensuring this. And anchoring this in human rights concept helps to stress the fundamental character of these rights as justiciable rights also in courts. But of course, what we want to see is not so much that people finally can start claiming their rights in front of courts for unjust treatment or rights that they are not getting granted, like access to affordable clean energy. I mean, don't get me wrong here. This is, of course, the ultimate essence of a fundamental right, yes, but we would, of course, rather like that those energy rights help us to implement better and more just energy transition policies as such in the first place, of course, And this is something that we as Just Climate work on, and together also with our partners, looking really into how to shape these energy policies with a better distributional outcome. Of course, being able to have them essentially backed up by energy rights, I think this is more than helpful here. And then starting with discussions like this, what we want to discuss today, about what these minimum sets of rights should be and at which level to set them. So, of course, and I think you were heading in the same direction here, Laszlo. Our interest is not to have a very theoretical debate, but of course also to base them on very practical ideas for how to use them and improvements for the everyday life of citizens in the energy transition. And therefore, we are really looking forward to this discussion we are going to have today, and also, first of all, of course, to this results presented by you. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the introductions, Laszlo and Claudia. As Laszlo mentioned, I'm Thomas. I'm the policy analyst for environment and climate here, and I will be the moderator for the rest of the session. So without further ado, Raphael Heffron, we're looking forward to seeing your presentation.
Thank you. So I would like to first thank Thomas and Luis, who have been, let's say, working on this over the last period of time. And thank you overall to FEPS for the support in developing this work. So let's say I won't spend too much time introducing myself. I'm a professor at the University of Po. But one of the things I do want to mention is let's say I do a lot of not just legal research, but also interdisciplinary research. And I also have a range of experience from different places in the world. So I try and bring in, that it's not just what can happen in the EU. The EU is also an institution that is trying to support other countries all over the world via, the European Investment Bank. So the EU has an obligation, not just internally, but also externally. And that's part of what I try and bring into the perspective. So in thinking about an energy minimum right, we have to provide, let's say, some, what is the basis of support for bringing in, such a right. And we can really see the momentum has gathered over the last couple of years. In particular, we've seen the UN chief say that we live in an age of justice. We've also seen in the last two COP conferences something that hasn't maybe quite received the attention it deserves, maybe in the media, but actually you can see that all countries have nearly agreed to establish a justice pathway. And that they had that meeting last year, 2 weeks before the start of COP. So, it wasn't on the main agenda, but they were all meeting about it before. And for me, this is probably one of the most significant developments when we think, let's say of last year, we think all countries are developing a justice pathway, but at the same time, they're also planning for their exit from fossil fuels. So we can see these maybe coming together, and that's maybe why we can think we have this platform to advance an energy minimum right. We can also see from a research perspective, I just have a list of these key journals there. They're some of the top interdisciplinary journals in the field. All of them are publishing justice research. So it's something that researchers from all disciplines, and let's say me start, let's say coming originally, let's say mainly from the law angle, and you would try and talk to people about law and justice, and they would say, okay, lawyers get paid too much money, let's move on and talk to someone else. But today, there are more people talking about justice than the lawyers themselves. Probably only 5% of the papers on justice in these journals are actually written or co-authored by lawyers. So for me, when I'm talking to a group of lawyers, I just say this is probably the greatest time to be a lawyer, because everyone wants to do research on justice. So, and to me, that's in a broad way why justice has become so important for policymakers today. So when we think of specifically justice for the energy sector, we can think of generally there are 5 key principles that we see in research or policy making. They are distributive, procedural, restorative, recognition, and cosmopolitan. And I will say a bit more about these, to be very brief, if you want a very brief example. Distributive is really about the finance system. Procedural is about the legal architecture or the legal system. Restorative is about trying to correct, let's say, injustices that exist, let's say from environmental impact, if you live near a coal plant, for example, and trying to prevent future injustices occurring. We now know how the pollution from different energy infrastructure, we should be doing something to, prevent that pollution. Recognition is about the who, so who are we targeting at a local or national level, and cosmopolitan is about the who internationally. And as Europeans, we should be more familiar with something like cosmopolitan justice, because we're thinking we have a progressive cross-border electricity market. We know what's happening. We are trying to work as one unit, representing all the EU countries and even neighboring countries. So in brief, that's what is behind this movement around energy justice, are these principles. And we can see, let's say, some countries have been more progressive than others. So despite the years of Donald Trump, and maybe even sadly the return of Donald Trump maybe later this year, hopefully not, but we can see that the US has still been very, very progressive. And you look at their Justice 40 initiative, and you can see that it's based on giving out 62 billion worth of subsidies. If you want to access some of that 62 billion, you have to show how your project has these 4 principles, and you'll see, oh, these are the principles that all the researchers are working on: procedural, distributive, recognition, restorative. One thing I particularly like about the US approach is they actually just took the definitions straight from research papers. So they said, here are our definitions. We're not going to debate them for years and years like we do in academia. They just took them from a couple of select research papers and said, this is the definition that we're working with now, and here's the way we are going to define it. And, just for the sake of interest, they did use a few of my papers and a couple of other people's. But when we think in more broadly, I just put up 3 examples of the leading countries who are adopting these principles into policy. So some people would say to me, when I talk about the US, I could present many, many more slides about the US, but let's say that's not the focus today. But they would say, what's happening in developing countries? Well, actually, developing countries are also using these principles, and they are finding, that they support their frameworks, they support attracting inward investment into their countries in terms of their energy sector. So it's positive, in terms of adopting these principles. So how do they relate in terms of thinking about this energy minimum right? Well, overall, when we're trying to think of an energy minimum right, what we're trying to do is really rebalance the, let's say, broken relationship that exists between, the government, between energy companies, and between civil society. We're trying to say, this is how risk, reward, and responsibility should be shared. Currently, we think, who has most of the risk? Well, I think we saw over the last couple of years, a lot of energy companies in Europe make what economists would describe as supernormal profits. I don't think they're taking on that big a risk, but they are getting all the reward. And what about responsibility? Well, carbon emissions are still going up, so they're not having, much responsibility for what's happening either. So what we want to do is rebalance that relationship. We need to start somewhere, and this is where the energy minimum right can come in. So there are several steps. We need a foundation of the study before we can look at it maybe from a more quantitative perspective. And let's say some of the key issues here are, debating about human rights, debating how would you measure a human right, what is a minimum threshold, which is very important, because what we're not saying here is, you need to go to every country and put in what is an energy human right into your legislation. We all know that would be very controversial, but what's easier to introduce in policymaking is establish what is a minimum threshold that we should be working towards. So a key difference, what we're trying to introduce here is, you'll have heard a lot of people talk in the EU around energy poverty. Energy poverty, if you look at this energy life cycle, which is used by the majority of scientists in thinking about the energy sector, between step 3 and 4, operation and supply consumption, that's where the energy poverty debate is. By only focusing on that, we're not thinking about what happens in the other areas of the energy system, the other energy activities. And let's say now that we are thinking about, cross-border taxation, we are slowly beginning to say, yes, there are cross-border issues. It's not just about the eventual electricity price to the consumer that creates energy poverty. So that's what we're trying to do in this energy minimum right, is think about the full energy life cycle and incorporate that in. So what we have here is a representation of this energy minimum right. And you can see at the core of the circle, we have the different forms of justice, and then we broaden out to all the factors that we put in. And we put these into, let's say, a quantitative model, which I can explain very briefly later if needed, but it will be in the publication. So, you know, you will get the publication in your email inbox in a couple of weeks. So we can say that a minimum threshold we established, let's say a notional 30%, because we have the justification from all the research and policy analysis to say this is what we should aspire to in Europe. That threshold may be different if we look in different parts of the world, or even if we looked in different regions, even within the EU, we might say, look, actually it has to be lower at maybe 22%. We're not saying every part of the EU needs to be aiming for 30 tomorrow, but we think of some of the regional just transition, regional development plans, we might start off with a lower target and, you know, work our way up, but we should be aspiring to that 30%. And you see here some of the countries we've initially done some analysis on: Hungary, Ireland, Germany, Italy, and you can see that Ireland is the worst performer. If you notice from my beautiful accent, I am Irish, but it wasn't that I took that, it was just by coincidence that they were the worst performer. That's not why I left the country either and work in France, but you can see there are many issues, but some of those issues, you know, are because Ireland is an island nation. You know, it isn't as easy to buy in electricity. They struggle, you know, in terms of getting new green energy. You know, it's one electricity grid, which is, you know, massive, hasn't received investment, etc. But what we can try and capture are many of these issues. And I just want to highlight maybe how we do this in a bit more detail. And I just give the example of Poland and a region in Poland to say, look, in Katowice, which is where more you know, associated, let's say, with the coal industry, very big in the just transition. And we're thinking Katowice is under that 30% threshold. And what we're trying to say is, you know, we can now pinpoint areas so that they could at least hit that threshold. And that's very important when we think of any new energy development, because what we can say to energy companies is, what is the current percentage in terms of an energy minimum right? What are you going to do that is going to bring that percentage up? And we can have more expectation. We can rebuild that relationship around risk, reward, and responsibility and say, this is how things need to change. So when we take it in Katowice in Poland, we can say, from distributive justice, we need to strengthen the regulator. We need to subsidize electricity and energy prices in the region. We need to focus on job creation. We need to reduce taxation for businesses. And these are some of the issues you can see in the part of the, let's say, the circle I took out. We look at distributive justice and we have those factors. And what we're looking for are different, you know, law, policy, different, what are the financial incentives? And we quantify them and put them into the model to get, you know, what exists in that region today, what exists in Poland. So Poland is a bit higher overall, but we can see that the region in Katowice is lower, and we, you know, can try and build that up in terms of an energy minimum right. So what are some of the next steps in terms of developing this? Well, we, you know, are concluding, let's say, the write-up of the quantitative analysis and explaining how we do that. But it also feeds into what can be referred to as energy justice milestone reports. So these reports that companies can be doing, local governments can be doing, where they have energy infrastructure in their region. And again, it's building into that justice pathway that I mentioned from the last two COPs, that you're having to think, how are we going to show we've improved on our justice pathway? And this research was just published recently in Nature Energy with a couple of engineers. And, you know, that shows you the commitment from the overall international scientific committee when we're thinking of nature energy as being the preeminent interdisciplinary journal, for any person in the energy research area to publish in, no matter what your discipline, that they are already thinking of those justice pathways and how we can achieve those in society. And an energy minimum right can play a key part in saying, how do we meet our goals in terms of that justice pathway? Some of the other areas are building it in, maybe in a broader way internationally. I'm part of the UNESCO Inclusive Policy Lab, so feeding it in there internationally if there's demand for this in other countries. We already know, let's say, some of the obligations the EU may have in terms of critical mineral extraction in different countries that will feed into the EU policy. I'm also one of the Just Transition peers in terms of the Just Transition, let's say the EU Just Transition European Commission initiative. So again, thinking about those regions in Europe which we know have been affected and are looking to increase, let's say, the socioeconomic condition of citizens. And very easily, the energy minimum right can actually give us a tracking mechanism to show what is the justice pathway for people in those regions. So thank you very much, and happy to take any questions and any suggestions you may have or considerations you think should be put in this research. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Raphael. The setup of this meeting was planned kind of like, excuse my background, an academic seminar. So I invited 3 people from different aspects of the energy justice angle to comment on it. The first one would be Monika Bucher, who is from the Kelso Institute Europe and is doing research on different kinds of community ownership of energy infrastructure or production.
Hello. Yeah, first of all, thank you, Mr. Heffron, for your presentation. It was very interesting, and it definitely I see some synergies with our research. So my name is Monika Bucher. I'm a PhD researcher at Kelso Institute Europe in Berlin. And having studied law myself, I underline Mr. Heffron's statement that being a jurist today is indeed probably the best opportunity to become a researcher and focus on justice questions, not only from a social science, but also from a legal perspective, which all too often is being ignored indeed. Hence, today I would like to bring a few new perspectives on the table that might fit Mr. Heffron's research with respect to minimum energy rights, namely the perspective of establishing a human right to form and/or to join an energy community and to produce and share energy collectively. Energy communities have the advantage that they could, in the best case, be self-sufficient. With the combination of wind energy, solar energy, heat pumps, and batteries, the load curve of these so-called energy clusters could be adequately balanced, avoiding blackouts. But why did we, the Kelso Institute Europe in Berlin, start to focus on the promotion of energy communities at all? Well, first of all, because we believe in its importance and potential for a successful and inclusive energy transition. But second of all, because it is closely connected to our foundation donor, Louis O. Kelso, and his wife, Patricia Kelso. Born in 1913, Louis O. Kelso was a US-American lawyer as well, and the inventor of the leverage buyout. Some of you might have heard of the leverage buyout already. It's a financial instrument commonly used in private equity to allow an investor to purchase a company primarily with borrowed funds. The assets of the company being acquired, as well as those of the acquiring company, are often used as collateral for the loans. The goal of a leverage buyout is to allow an investor that does not have so much money or a group of investors to make a large acquisition without having to commit a significant amount of their own capital. So connecting the leverage buyout tool to today's challenges, we know that the energy transition requires a lot of equity, a lot of money, and the purchase of big assets such as wind turbines and PV panels are very costly. Of course, a single person cannot afford buying a wind park, and not everybody can even afford to buy a PV panel. How can we combine the idea of the leverage buyout with the challenge of ensuring an inclusive energy transition for everybody? The solution in theory is simple. Less affluent people could join an energy community, pay their share to become a co-owner of the respective wind park, PV panel, etc., with a loan, and finally pay back this loan after a while with their energy savings made. Indeed, renewable energy communities have first been introduced in 2018-19 by the RED II, the Renewable Energy Directive, and the IMD, the Internal Electricity Market Directive. Since then, several EU member states have transposed the two directives into national law. However, looking at various studies, the success of renewable energy communities is rather moderate and until today poses three problems. Firstly, the number of successfully established energy communities in the EU is rather low compared to the potential of 450 million EU citizens. Secondly, the number of citizen energy communities in the wind energy sector, at least in Germany, is not only stagnating, but even decreasing. In the 90s, early 2000s, Germany was a pioneer when it comes to citizen wind parks. It was primarily the feed-in tariffs and hence fixed electricity prices that incentivized citizens and municipalities to collectively run a wind park. However, the shift from feed-in tariffs to auctions in 2017 led to a decrease in citizen energy communities. Since citizen energy communities now not only have to compete with professional market players for obtaining the permission to construct a wind park with others, but also cannot calculate with fixed electricity prices anymore, but only market prices, many potential citizen energy communities have dropped out of the market. Thirdly, those energy communities that do exist prove to be rather homogeneous, meaning their members are primarily, well, how to put it, well-educated white men in their 40s and 50s, hence a far leap from being just and inclusive. So now, what should be done to empower more citizens to produce and share renewable energy collectively? One best practice example on achieving a just and inclusive energy transition can be found in Austria. Here, the government has introduced the Solidary Energy Community, which enables citizens to share their excess energy with vulnerable households in their neighborhood. Another best practice example can be found in France, where members of social housing automatically become members of an energy community. However, they do have the option to opt out should they not want to be a member. When it comes to socializing auctions in the wind energy sector, the EU has already suggested to include criteria in the auction process that would help renewable energy communities win the auctions and give them extra points. Finally, subsidies for PV panels and other renewable energy assets should not only be directed to those who can afford them, but also help those who cannot afford them, but will be able to pay back a share through their energy savings. Lastly, a few remarks on why a right to form renewable energy communities is so important, summarized in 5 aspects. Firstly, the technical aspects. Studies show that co-ownership in renewable energy assets incentivizes people to consume their energy in a more demand-flexible way. This helps flatten the load curve and relieves the public grid. Then the democracy aspect. Citizen energy communities offer a balancing force vis-à-vis the market and the state dichotomy that usually governs the energy sector and allows for a more democratic, local, and bottom-up renewable energy production. The economic aspect. The more people participate in the energy transition, the more citizens can finance the energy transition with the energy savings made. The justice perspective. As a society, we should make sure that it is not only companies and affluent people who can afford renewable energy assets, but everybody. And then a philosophical aspect. Who owns the wind? Who owns the sun? Who owns the rivers? Shouldn't everybody have the chance to use these natural resources that are seemingly free of charge to produce renewable energy? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Monica. Interesting insights and new forms of ownership. And I pass on to Tijn Kroon, who is a researcher at TU Delft and the latest addition to the FEPS Young Academics Network, a fine institution that supports young academics in their journey.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Professor Heffron, for a fascinating presentation. I'm one of those more empirical researchers that looks into the third and fourth pillars of the energy system. So pardon me for that. And I've also got a list of questions, not as structured as Monica, which was a great narrative, but some very kind of, I made chaotic notes, both when reading through your draft and when listening to the presentation. Here they are. First, what I found fascinating was the fact that you talked about sufficiency and perhaps put that over equality as a kind of a target objective. And reading through the argumentation, I agreed, but I also wondered how you think this would align with kind of classical socio-democratic thought. So perhaps you could elaborate a bit on that. Then I just learned about the EMR quantification, which was very interesting. And I wondered how this compared to the resource allocation of the Just Transition Fund, which of course also allocated quite some resources to the Katowice area in Poland, but I believe for other reasons, other variables that you used. But I also learned that you are part of the Just Transition peers experts, so probably you have a very good explanation for that. Then I believe it wasn't part of the presentation, but it was part of the draft. The fact that there could be a hierarchy between those 5 energy justice principles. And I wondered in what contexts you believe this hierarchy could be justified. And then onto a bit more kind of the policy side of things. We heard examples from Austria and France. And I've got 2, sorry, they're not part of the EU anymore, but 2 UK examples that I would like to hear your thoughts on. One is the National Energy Guarantee, which is campaigned on by the New Economics Foundation. They basically try to materialize those energy minimum rights by pledging for block pricing, which is a very kind of straightforward way of doing it. So this would be a universal kind of system in which people pay lower tariffs for the first, let's say, 500 kilowatt hours that they consume. And in the UK, there's also a way more targeted policy instrument, which is the warm home discount. And how they've now implemented it, they've just reformed it. It's been effective since 2011, but just reformed. And they kind of match on one side, they do means testing. So they check whether people are eligible for certain benefits. And then on the other hand, they check whether they assume that a household has to consume more energy than average because of the quality of the home. And I have my doubts about the implementation, the design of the policy, but kind of the promise is there, right? That they try to identify who's in need of who cannot afford their energy, and then they subsidize the first, let's say, 150 pounds per year for those households. And I wonder how that then aligns with the idea, the principle of energy minimum rights, when implemented in a bit more socio-democratic way, progressive way. And that's my final question. How do you generally see the connection between energy minimum rights and the need for more targeted policy instruments? Because obviously we have a climate crisis. To subsidize energy, I think you need a very good justification for that. So do you think you can only maintain energy minimum rights in a targeted way, or is a more kind of universal policy instrument also thinkable in your view? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your remarks, Tyne, and the final first responder, first commentator is Rebecca Marciniak. She works at the S&D group in the Parliament and can give us a bit of a review what happened in the past legislature, and also will give her comments. Thank you, Rebecca, for joining us.
Thank you very much, and good morning also from my side. And also thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. And I must say that all this really requires and hopefully have a special attention also for the new Parliament. And of course, as you know, also S&D in those topics is one of the front runners when it comes to energy poverty. And myself, I'm advisor on energy, so I'm really more focused on the energy aspects of it and the just transition, etc. But at the same time, I would like to maybe, what was the takeaway from your presentation for myself, precisely was really the procedural aspect, how to find an opportunity, but also the rebalance the broken relationships you mentioned between the governance and then the energy providers and the civil society. And here I might kind of highlighted the two examples we had, because you might know within the European Green Deal, we had a really intensive negotiation, especially the energy packages there. Either it was the Energy Efficiency Directive, then Renewables Directive, but also the recent revision of electricity market design, where as Social Democrats, we really wanted to have a concrete concept, but also how to make those social implications implementable. And during most of negotiations, either internally, but also later with the member states, we often came to the question of how to make a certain right implementable. And maybe if I start with the concept of energy poverty, now, okay, firstly, we have, let's say, the legal basis within the Energy Efficiency Directive, but the way we developed the concept, of course, with the help of really, really great academics, was to really have a concrete indicators how to measure it. But not only, and those measurements and those indicators are not only those that people that cannot afford to pay the electricity bill, for example, but also to go much more broader, meaning those living in worse performing buildings, because at the end, we also speak here the right of well-being, the right of the healthy indoor environment, etc. And another concept here related is also people being in a situation where they need to choose between heating or eating. So all these rights and concepts we really wanted to kind of feed into implementation of, for example, of Energy Efficiency Directive. Now, the challenges we were facing there were asking, again, the member states when it comes to the social policies. We cannot mix energy policy versus the social policy. And then whenever it came to the implementation, it was really that we have our own social backgrounds, social concepts within our national states. So we don't need a new additions to it. So my question here would be how to fill in the gap between the social policy, the energy policy, especially when it comes to social part of energy policy, how this to be recognized in practice. And the second example, and then I will, of course, slowly to conclude, is within the electricity market design. We've been a strong voice there to really ensure that there will be really the prohibition from electricity disconnections. And here we were mostly targeting the vulnerable groups and those people affected by energy poverty. Again, the challenges we had there is the fact that will the member states or will the governments regulate the energy providers to ensure a minimum share of electricity to be available even during the periods of disconnections? And here this was a big question, how to make this prohibition implementable? Again, the same concept. And here relates to the aspects you mentioned on how to rebalance the broken relationships, because of course the governments don't want to take responsibilities, at the same time neither the energy providers in that sense. And here, of course, we already have some good examples from some of the member states where the kind of a minimum share of electricity, at least to ensure the work of the basic appliances like charging your phone, being able to cook and or heat. But at the same time, those things are not as broad across the European spectrum. So here I would also like to understand a bit your position, how to fill in this gap, how to make such, okay, I gave an example of concrete right, if you can say it that way, and not to be disconnected when it comes to not being able to pay your bill. But yeah, also just to hear your opinion on how to tackle this in practical terms. And yes, I will stop at that. So much.
Thank you, Rebecca. We're doing really well time-wise. I would suggest to open up the floor now and give you an opportunity at the end to respond. Is that, or would you prefer to maybe respond? Yeah, okay, maybe respond to these, and everyone here in the room can think about their questions, and then afterwards we can come back to you and ask questions or allow questions from the online audience.
So thank you to all three of you for your comments and feedback, and let's say I'll try and answer them maybe in a collective way. So the first thing I would say is, you know, as Monica also said, you know, it's a great opportunity at the moment for lawyers talking about justice. But one of the things is when you're a lawyer, you take a more cynical view, as it were, to life. And let's say when I'm thinking of one of the comments that you made about the warm homes, let's say, initiative in the UK, what I would say is, if you know, there's a sort of joke among lawyers in the UK that how, you know, you'd see a lawyer with a happy smile after Christmas, and you go, why are lawyers always so happy after Christmas? I mean, it's coming into January, the worst month of the year, but the reason is that a lot of their clients have died, and they've been writing the wills for the clients so that they're making lots of money. And the reason the clients have died is because they haven't had warm homes. And what I would say is, you know, what we're thinking of here, maybe with the minimum energy right, is we're looking at maybe more medium to longer term change. Because why is it that when we look at the electricity system, you know, we're having to pay out constantly? How many years will we pay for the warm home? I can tell you, as someone who lived in the UK for, you know, many years, the subsidy would nearly barely last, you know, 2 months, and then it's back to, you know, the cold. But again, these are just short-term fixes. And even when we think about the electricity market design, again, some of those are just short-term solutions. And I'm not saying that they're a bad idea. I'm just saying that we want something a bit more constructive to think of more, you know, how do we get more medium to longer term change? And I think that relates to when we think about what are the ideas that we can generate, these new ideas, things like energy communities. You know, you were talking about leverage buyouts. I mean, there should be so many different types of financial options available to us. And I think part of the energy minimum right is to say we can target justice improvements by different innovations, you know, access to technology, access to finance, and I think access to knowledge. Many people don't really know what are the solutions. They get told, oh, a solution is you get £150 subsidy. I can guarantee not everyone is even accessing that £150 because they don't know how to access. So, but what we need to think is, you know, a step further and think, you know, what is a sort of threshold we should aspire to? How do we get some of these new initiatives? Not every policy initiative to get there has to work. So, I mean, there could be various examples, as you gave, in terms of thinking about energy communities. You know, how do we get some of those maybe to work so that, you know, we don't have to fully redesign the electricity market because people already have a threshold of energy that they can say, well, I have access to this solar panel, you know, I have access in a community to a small bit of energy, you know, if there is a blackout or if I don't have access for, you know, during the day. So I think we need to be thinking in let's say more broadly, and I suppose that's the target of the energy minimum right, is that we're trying to think of this, you know, around that full energy life cycle, so that when we think of the energy minimum right, we're really building it into what are the future options for energy. So we don't end up with the same broken system where we keep paying out subsidies. You know, we're not fully supporting even energy communities to develop properly. That we should be saying, once a company drafts the environmental impact assessment, it should be part of that process to say, what are you going to do so that we don't end up giving subsidies in some form in the future? And for me, you know, I did mention subsidies, but you know, part of subsidies can be given in more innovative ways to create jobs, to create, you know, new business opportunities, such as, you know, in an energy community, new access to the technology, new access to, you know, knowledge where people can better understand energy efficiency. So I think, you know, for me, in terms of thinking about that implementation, I think what we would need to think is, implementation-wise, there are some key easy steps. We know that countries are now developing their just, you know, transition pathways. That's an obligation under, you know, the COP conferences. And what we need to think about, how do we feed that in at a national level? Probably the easiest way is to think about future options, and within that environmental impact assessment framework to say, look, we know all the problems that you're going to create. We can list off 20. How are you going to prevent those 20? And show us you're going to turn that, let's say that 22% in Katowice, you're going to turn that into 40%. You know, we don't need to see that type of infrastructure. Show us another option that you can change the system. So for me, that would be the easiest way to implement. And I think, you know, creating knowledge around all the different financial options that people could use to support, let's say, local energy initiatives, and increase that, let's say, knowledge base. And I think, you know, that's where, you know, the research community and maybe the young academic network that you're establishing here, you know, can really make an impact, because we need the new ideas, we need the new options, and, you know, we need to be able to say, whether it's in Spain, the Czech Republic, Poland, Ireland, we need to be able to say, look, these won't work in your country, but maybe these 6 or 10 options will work. And we need that sort of, a bit like a library shelf, and you're able to take off certain books and apply it to, you know, that country and build up that energy minimum right. And I do think companies are involved, because I've already spoken to, since we're being recorded, a big French energy company, and, you know, I will be presenting to them next week, and I will be touching, you know, I know that they're very interested in the just energy transition, and they're very interested in how can they begin to play their role, because they're aware that once these justice pathways come in at a national level, they will be forced to have their own, you know, a bit like the decision where, you know, in the courts in the Netherlands, where Shell were asked, you know, how are you contributing to the international climate change agenda? You know, the Netherlands is doing this, you're based in the Netherlands, what are you doing? And the companies are beginning to be aware they have to show what they're going to do. And what's easier than to say, look, we went into this area, the standard energy minimum right, which crosses into the socioeconomic, let's say, conditions, that was 10% before we came in. We're not saying we're an excellent company, but what we have done is we've increased it to 22, and we have plans where in 10 years' time, it'll be 40, 45. A quick response.
Thank you very much for this set of responses. Are there any questions in the room already? Yes, please, and please introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks very much to all of you. My name is Rihanna from E3G, also a climate and energy think tank. I was wondering, because you mentioned the transition pathways as sort of a vehicle potentially for this as a standard, do you also see where it might fit within EU legislation, or if it's already happening at a national level, anywhere in EU, or sort of where would this concretely fit as a policy?
Yeah, well, let's say two places. Very simply. The first would be the one I already mentioned, the environmental impact assessment legislation. That generally gets reformed from time to time, or new additions can be created. But there's no reason why that couldn't be. This could be part of that to show really what is the company doing to improve. Issues in a certain region. If you're building in a certain region, you should be able to say, this is what we're doing, and now we can track it on this pathway, which contributes, to the national framework that a company needs to do. So that would be the first. The second one, I think, in many countries, we have a national energy regulator, and we should start thinking that it's energy. It's not just electricity, and we should be thinking about that full life cycle to say, look, if and I would use the, maybe if we thought about the UK, although it's not part of it, the EU anymore, but you're thinking, how are we trying to change this, warm homes initiative, the subsidy? We need more options. And I think it is a responsibility of the National Energy Regulator to provide more options. And I wonder if in some countries, if you could probably, I'm sure you could legitimately write a legal opinion that said basically it was already part of their responsibility. And if you were civil society, that you could actually challenge them and take a case of why they weren't creating sufficient options for citizens to move away and to have a sort of a threshold that they could work, from. So it would be to introduce it maybe as an obligation of a national energy regulator. And where the energy regulator wasn't that strong, it could be in some position like an ombudsman, a consumer. Different countries call it differently, a consumer ombudsman. And you could build it into the requirement in their office. So it would be part of that ombudsman obligation to explore this issue. And I think those changes could be achieved without having to go back to, let's say, a national law making process, which, as we all know, is very time consuming. So easier ways to target would be that sort of sub-regulation, as it were, for the ombudsman or for the energy regulator. But definitely, I've already discussed it with some people about the ombudsman framework, and there is a lot of merit to say it's what someone in that office should be doing. And I suppose it connects actually more broadly with a word some of you may have come across already, that I see more of the policy debate talk about future proofing. And this was from a United Nations document in 2022, where they talk about future proofing the energy system. And the idea of future proofing is you're meant to be looking forward. And if you don't look forward in your energy decision making, you will be held accountable. And what the UN was indicating was you could be held accountable beyond your office, because so that would mean that that became a personal obligation, that you could no longer hide behind your political office or your company office, because this is stuff you should have been doing in your job anyway. So if you were earning 5 or 6 million a year as chief executive, with share options of 20, 30 million when you leave the job after 5 years, some of that could be taken back because you did not fulfill your obligation. And they use that word future-proofing. And I wonder, could you tie future-proofing to the ombudsman to say, look, as an ombudsman, you do have obligations to think about what is a sustainable policy option in the future. Giving someone a subsidy to pay their electricity bill every year is not long-term sustainable. It's not creating any solution really of value. And meanwhile, all the pollution keeps happening. People are living next to polluting infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So we're not changing the overall, let's say, minimum energy right that people should be having, which connects with some of those other socioeconomic policies. So there are solutions out there. We just maybe need to connect some of the ideas more, and maybe that'll be in the young, that'll be research done by the young network, or maybe in future work that we can do collectively.
Thank you, Raphael, already future-proofing our work here. I saw two hands, Taube maybe first, and then Stefan, correct? And maybe we'll collect some questions. I also have one more.
Thank you so much, Taube from the Green European Foundation. Thank you for this presentation, and also already the feedback of the other participants. I want to build on Rihanna's point and also on Ten's point. I think it's a very, very useful framework that you're proposing, because it has so much kind of leverage potential to break also at European level through like the barriers that are there within energy policy and climate policy, as well as the lack of the international dimension. I feel like a lot of the times is still there in our energy transition at EU level. So I think it has a lot of potential. I would also think with the governance regulation of the energy union, you could link it as well, because the NECPs are an important tool for the governance at the member state level. And if there is some sort of an obligation to also develop in those plans a more holistic framework on minimum rights that also link to the international dimension, I think it would be kind of pushing member states to go into that direction. I have a specific question that builds on what Tane was mentioning on the relationship between the different 5 aspects. Did you ever think of maybe also having a sort of threshold on each of those aspects, to not have the case that some countries score very well on like the top line on the global bit on the overall picture, but that they actually very underperform on other aspects, and that kind of like slips to the through the gaps? That's a question. Thanks.
Thank you, Taube. And let me just add, I'm very grateful for the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung colleagues that they came today, because you have your own event on right after this, so that's why Stefan left early. And maybe I can slip in my small question before I hand over to Stefan, because it relates to your event actually, which is on women and energy. And where exactly does the gender aspect come into the energy minimum right concept? So, please, and introduce yourself.
Yes, thanks very much. I'm Stefan Engling from the office of Timo Wölken, still MEP and now also continuing to be, luckily. And maybe it's a bit of a devil's advocate point of view, but especially when we look at renewables infrastructure, so wind, solar, but now also ever more increasingly the grid infrastructure, which needs a lot of infrastructure adds and overhauls. There's a considerable delays from point of investment decision to actually starting to build. And this is something that we tried to address in the last mandate with the reform of the Renewable Energy Directive, and various sort of planning facilitations, that you have these go-to areas where under certain conditions, both for grid and the actual production infrastructure, you can forego, for example, the environmental impact assessment on the project level if you have done one on the overall level. Now, my question would be, if we integrate this EMR, which I think is a very useful methodology, back into the environmental impact assessments, is there not a risk that we then add another step to the planning and permitting that will possibly increase these delays? And related to that, do we already have some international experience, for example, from the US and their Justice 40 initiative, if the outflow of the subsidies is actually going smoothly and the project developers are sort of hitting those targets regularly?
Are there any immediate interventions on the floor? No, then Raphael, go ahead.
Yeah, so in terms of those questions, in terms of thinking about the 5 aspects, yeah, so what the model does allow you to say, it does add it up for each aspect. So you can say, you know, which one a project or which one a country may be even underperforming on. So it could be that, let's say on the cosmopolitan one, which is more international, that you're actually saying, well, you know, you may be saying that things are going well, but actually, you know, internationally, you are not meeting certain conditions. So you could think of countries which are exporting, you know, maybe a lot of their oil and gas, they're exporting the problem away. Or you could think of countries with energy companies who are doing a lot of activities that would not be accepted generally in their own country. So, you know, there are many things you could target, but yes, it does allow you to say which of these justices you actually need to improve. You could be scoring highly, and that relates maybe to the question on gender. So gender comes in terms of recognition justice, and you're looking how what policies have been initiated in that area, what is the impact, what is the participation level, and you know, you can look in different countries and see, well, actually recognition justice as a score is well below the threshold, and usually gender is you know, one of the key areas that they could use to bring it up. And then the final question in terms of linking it in with, let's say, investment decisions. So for me, this is a question that comes up a lot and in many different countries. But what I would say is, for many countries, one of the biggest reasons for project delay, one of the most costly reasons, are where you have protests from local communities, which happen in let's say the operational phase, not just the construction, but in construction and operational phase. So for me, the sooner you manage the sort of justice performance of a project, and the sooner you do that at the outset, it'll prevent costly delays in construction and once you're in operation. And if you actually ask some of the big energy companies, they will tell you more of the costly delays happen in the construction and the operational phase, and they are realizing if they had planned the project properly, they would not have all these costs in operation and construction and operation. So by introducing it at the outset, I believe it would make the decision making faster, and it would also show to the financier that you have a plan, and that plan goes from all the way from construction through operation and even through to decommissioning. And that should actually show the financier you are not going to experience the same delays as another project who doesn't build that into the system. therefore your project borrowing costs should actually be lower. And I'm actually involved in doing some of that work for 8 or 9 energy companies in Colombia, where they are building a transmission system linked to wind farms, and they are looking at exactly making sure that they have this in the project planning phase, and that means no protests later on. And in the US context, I think I've done some work on analysing how the money's been spent, but to say effectively, how effective or efficient the whole process has been is something that I am with some other members of my team doing some ongoing research on that. So the money has only started going out, so it would be too early of me to say on live recording my full answer. But we do have initial paper draft, which probably will be ready at some stage over the summer. So I mean, I'd be happy to share the draft analysis. And we did around 20 interviews in 3 different states in America to look at exactly those questions. So once I have the draft, I'd be happy to share a copy with you, because usually it takes a couple of years to get published in the top journals. So I won't make you wait that long, but I'll share a draft. I'll be happy to share a circulated draft with everyone here if they're interested.
Thank you. We will definitely follow up on this event with an email, and also the contact is here. I see Claudia is on her way out. Much luck with your event. We have 2 interventions from the online participants. Should I just read them out, or probably? Okay. So Sophia Martinez from the Green Economy Coalition. One important issue is energy efficiency, and high upfront costs is the main barrier for many households, despite existing subsidies. How to deal with that? And then she continues, Raphael, you mentioned cross-border electricity markets, but Europe still is highly dependent on foreign oil and gas. Do we include that also on the cosmopolitan angle? And then further on with examples, which I will share later with you. I'm not going to read everything out. And then Fatih Belaid, thank you for the excellent presentation. There has been talk about subsidizing energy, while on the other hand, many voices in emerging countries are calling for price reforms and phasing out subsidies. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this contrasting approach and the implications on low-income communities.
In relation to the first question, I think, and it goes back to something that Claudia said at the start. But when people think of the cost of the transition, what I always say is, why are we discussing the cost of the transition? We should be talking about the cost if we don't do the transition, which we know will be much, much greater. There's some recent research in, I think it was in Nature Energy, which shows that the cost if we don't do the transition will be greater. So actually, the transition cost is the least cost pathway for society. And I think, to me, that reflects on the argument of energy efficiency. So when I think of energy efficiency, I would go back to an example that I was at a talk with Stephen Chu, who used to be, he's a Nobel Prize winner in physics. He's a professor in Berkeley in California, but he was secretary for energy in, I think it was in the Obama administration. And he gave the example himself that when we talk about energy efficiency, it's really about standard setting. We get told energy efficiency will be costly, but actually in California, they said, how do we improve energy efficiency for white goods that we use in the home? And they said the lawyers, a positive role for lawyers. The lawyers said, well, why don't we just set the standard? And they set it relatively high. And the engineers said, oh, we can't meet that in 3 years. And the economist said, you're going to increase the cost hugely for consumers. They will be able to afford these white goods. And actually, the policymakers said, we continue with setting the standard at this high level. And what they found after 3 years was that actually the engineers were able to meet the energy efficiency standards. They actually surpassed it, and they actually lowered the cost of the white goods. So actually they completely challenged, excuse me, they completely challenged the economic assumption that if we bring in higher standards, we always will end up with higher costs. And I think, that coming from someone who was leading policy making for a term of office, a term and a half, I think, is something that we should reflect on. And he and several other academics wrote up the paper on that. And I think it's a useful thing. We think we need to be far more ambitious. We keep getting told, oh, this will be costly. The reason we're not doing this is it will be costly. And I think that relates to the second question of Sophia, the cross-border. Yes, that relates to cosmopolitan justice. We do need to move away from oil and gas. That's part of the obligation that we should have in the EU collectively. And I think that relates to the subsidies question. We know from subsidy studies and research done on subsidies that we're still giving more subsidies to oil and gas than we are to renewables. What I would like to see is a capital reallocation to let's subsidize renewable energy. I remember when I used to come to the EU first, and all I would hear is we need to let clean energy eat in these into the market system. And I would say the market system is already unfair because we're subsidizing oil and gas and coal at the extra when we take it out of the ground. So we don't have fair electricity markets because we've over subsidized them at the extractive level. That's why they can sell electricity for cheaper. So for me, we need to get that subsidy finance and start subsidizing renewables in a greater way. And I saw a call recently by someone, I think it was someone related to the IPCC report or the next phase of it, and they were just saying, we need to be thinking about the clean energy system and subsidies in a way like we thought about the COVID vaccines. It's a straight example of subsidizing a sector for the common good. So we should be just thinking, yes, subsidies are good. They will help us transition faster, and they should move the money away from, let's say, where the majority of subsidies are going today.
Very nice. Thank you, Raphael. I would suggest we close it here and take the further discussion the informal section. I want to emphasize the two final things that you said. We're still subsidizing fossil fuels too much, or we're still subsidizing them. And also engineers can work wonders if we just set the standards high. So that would be it from my side. Thank you very much for joining the discussion. And Laszlo, maybe you want to give final word?
Thank you very much. I have nothing to add to the content. On the other hand, as a host, I thank you for coming today. It's my role to invite you to a light lunch, which FEPS can serve to you. And please continue the informal discussion after closing the formal one. Thank you very much and see you next time.